Lincoln, his sisters, and Clyde all continued to huddle together in the shady, dead house as the sounds of turmoil outside slowly faded into nothing. The sound of silence was ghastlier than the sounds of screaming. Screaming meant that the kids outside were still alive. Now all Lincoln could hear was the sound of his sister's breathing, Clyde's sniffling, and his own heartbeat. The fear he felt was worse than the kind he felt after watching the dumb Harvester movie. However, the love and need to protect his sisters was stronger than the possibility of getting torn to pieces by zombies. Zombies, Lincoln thought. The word reminded him of the time everyone in the house got sick, and he and his healthy sisters, besides Lenny, called them that. They all thought they would be the closest thing to the zombie apocalypse they would experience, but all it was a stint of their overactive imaginations. There was no way that any of their knowledge of going through that could possibly help them now. After all, what was happening out there was far worse than anything Lincoln, his sisters, or Clyde had ever gone through. Lincoln looked down at his sisters, who were all huddled around him together and holding each other. He hoped more than anything that his older sisters were alive and unharmed. He needed someone to take charge. He may have prided himself on always being ready for anything, as well as coming up with plans for any solution, but this time he just couldn't do it alone. The sounds of speedy footsteps began to appear, increasing the closer they got to the door, and then the doorknob began to jiggle as a sound of frantic banging filled the whole house, putting an end to the silence. "Hey!" a distressed voice called out. "Open up, please!" They all recognized the voice as soon as they heard it. "Lynn!" everyone shouted, as they shot up from their sitting positions and made a mad dash towards the door. Lincoln and Clyde shoved the couch out of the way, while Lucy unlocked the door. Lynn burst through the door as soon as she could fit through it, and she slammed it and locked it. She was breathing heavily and leaned against the door with her eyes staring straight down at the floor. She could see beads of sweat fall to the ground on her shoes. Then she heard the pitter-patter of small feet making their way towards her, and then felt arms begin to wrap around her legs. She gasped and turned around in such a frantic manner that it caused her younger siblings to let go and step away from her. She looked down and saw the worried faces of Lana and Lola staring up at her. "Lynn!" she heard Lincoln call out to her. The older Loud looked and saw his face filled with the same worry as the twins. Lynn panned her eyes across the entire room, taking in every detail. She saw Clyde standing right next to Lincoln, and the couch moved in position so that it was no longer blocking the door, followed by Lucy and Lisa standing behind them, along with their dog Charles. She then noticed Lily sleeping in her baby carrier seat. She was beginning to stir at all the noise. She looked back down at the twins and tried to swallow. Her mouth was dry. "Lynn?" Lincoln repeated. She turned back to him and noticed that he was beginning to tear up. "Are you okay?" Lynn looked down at her outfit. Her usual sports jersey was stained with blood. She looked back up and feigned a smile. Yeah, I'm fine." She noticed her younger siblings staring at her jersey as well. "Don't worry, this isn't my blood." Her comments, while reassuring, still worried her siblings. They all continued to stare at her. She spread her arms out in a friendly manner. "Bring it in," she encouraged. They all, Clyde including, squeezed against her and held her tight. Even Charles tried to join in on the group hug. "We were so worried," Lola began to cry. Lynn smiled at her siblings. "Don't worry, it'll take more than a few crazies to take down Lynn Loud Jr." They all stepped away, smiled, and nodded. Lynn then walked over to Lily, who was now beginning to open her eyes, while Lincoln and Clyde moved the couch back up against the door. "Hey there, Lil," she said, gently stroking her cheek. The baby smiled and cooed. A recollection began to form in Lynn's head. Lily was here because she was sick. She guessed that it was a good thing, that it meant she got to stay home and not be out there in the screwed up world, as well as her mom. Like a swinging baseball bat had hit her. "Mom!" Lynn quickly pulled away from Lily and spun towards her siblings so fast that it startled them. "Where's Mom?" she demanded. They all stood frozen in place, eyes widening as soon as she finished her question. Lincoln fought hard to keep the tears down, as he searched wildly to find the right words. He felt all of his siblings turning to him. It might not be him that told her, being the second oldest sibling at the moment. He was basically second in command. "Where is she?" Lynn repeated, the tone of her voice becoming more critical, which caused Lily to whimper. Sweat and tears slowly poured down Lincoln's face as he opened his mouth to speak, but before any sound could escape, a quiet voice beat him to it. "She's dead," Lucy said grimly. She may have been the quietest of all the loud children, but at that moment, it felt like she was the loudest person on earth. Everyone looked at her and then back at Lynn, who took a step back as if she had been physically struck. Her entire body suddenly began to become drenched in sweat. She looked at every one of her siblings. Lana and Lola's eyes teared up. Lucy and Lisa stood stone-faced, and Lincoln took a step towards her. By the time we got here, she was already gone. Lincoln just left it at that. She didn't know what had happened next. Lynn's vision became blurry. As she shook her head in denial, she frantically wiped the sweat from her forehead and face, and she tugged on the collar of her jersey as if to let steam out. They all became worried by her agitation. Then Lincoln spoke. "Lynn, are you—" "I need water," she blurted out. "I'll go get you some," Lincoln said, beginning towards the kitchen. But Lynn suddenly bolted past him and practically crashed into the fridge. She opened it and grabbed the first water bottle she saw, guzzling it down as fast as she could. "Lynn, easy," Lincoln pleaded, but she ignored him. The water quickly filled up more than she could handle. She quickly slanted forward and harshly coughed up water and some bile. She hurled the half-empty plastic bottle down as hard as she could and swore. "Lynn!" she heard Lincoln shout, as well as her sisters gasp. Lincoln stepped up to Lynn and wrapped his arms around her. He held her as she continued to yell and swear, both shaking as the same emotions while their siblings and Clyde stood, sobbing at the entryway in the kitchen. Eventually, Lynn stopped cursing, which prompted her younger siblings to stop crying. "Are you okay?" Lincoln asked, which he knew was a stupid question. Lynn just found out her mom was dead. There was no way she was okay. Lynn just stood there and sniffed. Her face was red. She was sad, angry, and embarrassed. She hardly ever showed weakness in front of her siblings. I'm sorry, she said. "It's okay," Lincoln replied. "We're all scared." Lynn pulled herself away from Lincoln. "Who said I was scared?" she exclaimed. Lincoln was surprised by her sudden change in attitude. His younger sisters and Clyde became perturbed by this as well. "Well," he began, but Lynn interrupted. "I'm not scared. I'm agitated, I'm confused, I'm tired, and most of all, I'm fucking pissed." Lincoln was now searching for more words, but again, he couldn't think of anything. "When I woke up this morning, I didn't think everyone would end up going crazy. When I said goodbye to Mom as we left for school, I didn't think it'd be the last time I'd see her alive, and her dad, oh God, he's probably dead too." Lynn rubbed more sweat from her face as she continued to rant. "Until an hour or so ago, I thought the worst thing that would happen to me today was that I got smacked in the face with a fucking volleyball." Lynn suddenly knelt and clenched her stomach. It hurt from drinking the cold water too fast and throwing up. "Lynn?" Lincoln knelt down to her and tried to put a hand on her shoulder, but she smacked it away. "Where is she?" "What? Where is my mom?" She quickly stood up and lifted Lincoln along with her. "She's in her room," he told her. Lynn rushed past him and her younger sisters and burst through the doors of their parents' room. And there lay their mom, read aloud, wrapped up in bed covers. Lynn stood flustered at the doorway. She wanted to tear the covers away of her mom and take one last look at her, but she decided against it. She wanted the cheerful, smiling image of her mom standing on the front porch, waving goodbye to her and her siblings as they left for school this morning to be the things she saw of her, not whatever was wrapped underneath those covers. She exhaled, closed the door, and went over and plopped down next to Lily, who was still lying in her baby carrier. She stared at Lynn with the same worried expression. Lynn couldn't bring herself to smile this time. Lynn wondered how her mom had died. She had kind of an idea of what might have happened, but she dare not ask Lincoln or any of the sisters about it. Lincoln and her sisters walked over and sat beside her. After a few seconds, Lincoln finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said again. "It's okay, little bro," Lynn assured him. They continued to sit there in silence until Lucy spoke up. "What was it like out there?" she asked. Even though she had already been out there, now she wanted to hear it from Lynn's point of view. "How did you survive?" Lynn closed her eyes to keep the tears from flowing. Once she was sure they wouldn't show, she took a deep breath and began to explain how she managed to survive out there. "I was in the middle of softball practice with my friends," Lynn began. I was batting and already made 2 strikeouts. One of my friends jokingly told me not to get hit in the face. That irritated me. I didn't want to strike out again. Once the pitcher threw the ball, I swung as hard as I could. I don't know if I hit it because as soon as I swung the bat, there was a flash, and the entire sky roared louder than the crowd in the sporting event I'd ever been to. Lincoln and everyone else shuddered. The sound of the blast was still fresh in their minds. I drove down and waited for my ears to stop ringing. Once they stopped, I got up and looked over to the dugout. Lynn paused, wiping sweat away from her forehead again. I saw my coach attacking one of my teammates. Everyone ran up to her and tried their best to drag her off the girl. I helped too, of course. But once we pulled her away, blood quickly gushed from her neck where she had been bitten. Lincoln wanted to be shocked at how similar the story was to what happened in the classroom so far, but couldn't. There was no doubt that what happened at the beginning to him and his sisters happened to every other school kid. Soon, one kid ran up to her coach and hit her as hard as she could on the head with a metal baseball bat. One hit was all it took. Then we all turned back to the injured girl. At this point, blood was flowing out of her so fast that her face turned pale. Lynn paused again as she remembered seeing the girl's face filled with fear and tears. Someone tried to pinch the wound together with a cloth, but it did nothing. All we could do was comfort her until she stopped moving. And then, we all ran away. We just left her body there. Lynn's eyes began to tear up again, and Lincoln and her siblings tried their best to comfort her until she continued. We all tried to run and find other adults, only to find them attacking kids as well. So I just ran from the school as fast as I could. I ran like I never ran before. I must have broken some of my own personal records. She joked, trying her best to smile. And that's when I finally reached your school. She paused again, trying to think about what to say next. And you went into the building? Lana asked, shocked, before Lynn could finish. Yeah, of course, Lynn lied. I had to go find my sisters. She smiled and patted Lana on the head. But when I couldn't find you, I was so worried. I thought you were all... Lynn didn't finish. Instead, she closed her eyes and turned her head towards the floor. It's okay, Lane. Lincoln was able to save us, Lana told her. Lynn's eyes popped open and she snapped her head back at Lana. Yeah, Lola agreed. He's so brave. As soon as the grown-ups went nuts, he came and saved us. He helped me escape from my teacher, Lucy added. And he also tried to use himself as a distraction when Mr. Grouse attacked us. Lisa also interjected. He also helped some of our classmates when adults tried to attack them as well, Clyde inserted. They all also thought of saying when Lincoln tackled their own mom to save them, but decided against it. Well, Lincoln began, I didn't exactly come straight for you four. You see, I tried to escape the school at first, but once I realized you were all probably still in there, me and Clyde went straight back in to find you all. Lincoln's sisters didn't mind. What mattered the most was that he risked his life for them by coming back. Lynn sat, shocked at what she had just heard. Her eyes began to water, and her face quickly became drenched in sweat again. She stood up and paced away from them. Lynn? Lincoln said. She didn't respond. Thoughts swirled inside her head. Thoughts of her just standing and watching as her coach bit into her teammate. Thoughts of her standing in front of her younger sibling's school, her legs wobbling as she stood frozen in front of it. The sounds of horrified screams filling the building. She was terrified at the thought of one of those screams belonging to their younger siblings. She watched the building slowly inch away from her as she backed away from it. Before she realized it, she was standing in the road. The sound of a car barreling towards her snapped her out of her stupor. She looked and saw an old-looking car driving straight towards her, its driver looking completely insane. She quickly dove out of the way as the car whizzed by her, not slowing down at all. Fuck, these things can drive cars? She thought at first, but as the car continued to fly down the road, she decided that it was probably just some lunatic. However, she noticed that the lunatic was an adult. Does that mean not all adults are infected? As soon as she knew these crazy adults couldn't drive cars besides that one, she couldn't let her siblings know that she was too scared to go into the school and look for them, as much as it guilted her. She couldn't let them know that Lincoln, her younger brother, was braver than she was. Lynn? Lincoln said again. Huh? Lynn snapped back at him. Are you okay? He asked. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm so glad you're all okay. Her siblings smiled back at her. Lynn faked another smile back at them. Inside her head, she could still hear the screams of the kids as she ran away from the school. She tried her best to get the sounds out of her mind, but she realized that the screams weren't coming from her head. They were coming from beyond the front door. They all jerked her head towards the door, instantly recognizing the scream, a scream that they had heard multiple times before, only it was usually accompanied by the screech of electric guitar. They all spoke in unison, "Luna!" They all rushed towards the door and quickly unlocked it, and moved the couch enough so that their sister would be able to fit through it. As they opened it, they saw Luna, with Luann standing right next to her. The looks of panic were clear on their faces. They were all relieved to see their two sisters that were still alive and well. "Get in!" Lincoln instructed them. They didn't need to be told twice. Luna stepped aside and let Luann squeeze through the opening first. As she stepped inside, Lincoln noticed that her hair was no longer up in a ponytail. In fact, it looked like it had gotten shorter. Luna squeezed through the door next. Both of their faces seemed to be flustered than Lynn's, which probably had to do with the fact that their high school was further away from the middle school. Lincoln wondered why his two older sisters, Lori and Lenny, weren't with them. Maybe they got separated or something, Lincoln told himself before slamming the door and locking it, and barring the couch back up against it. He then looked back at his two older sisters, who were being enveloped by their four younger sisters. They bombarded them with questions, and Lola and Lana each gave their arms wrapped around their legs. Luna and Luann's eyes began darting back and forth at each other, their siblings. They looked both relieved to see them alive, but for some reason they looked very uneasy. "Give them some room to breathe, guys," Lincoln told them. His younger sisters all hushed and turned towards Lincoln, shooing him looks of dismay. "Yeah," Lynn agreed with Lincoln as she started towards the two exhausted-looking sisters. "These two had quite a run the distance. They'll be able to give you hugs in a little bit." The younger siblings all stepped away to let Lynn stand closer to Luna and Luann. She eyed them up and down. "Are you two okay?" The two sisters exchanged glances and then turned back to Lynn and nodded. The adults," Luna began. "They all went totally bonkers." "We know," Lynn told them. They both looked around the room and noticed that Lily looking up at them. They smiled, and the look of the fear suddenly tightened on their faces. "Where's Mom?" they both asked at once. They looked their siblings in the eyes and noticed their looks of grief. Lynn broke the news to them. The two older sisters shocked at the news, and then their faces contorted into a look of pure agony. Luna began to tremble in her boots. She could feel her heartbeat like a bass drum, and constant booming sound like it made her feel like her whole body was vibrating. Luann knew it was a long shot, but she hoped that her sibling was just kidding. She hoped that it was just them getting back at her for all the years she spent pranking them. But she knew the look in their faces were genuine. They both looked at the door to their mom's room, imagining how she must have looked lying dead on the floor. Then they collapsed on their knees and held each other as they sobbed. The rest of the loud siblings surrounded the crying sisters and held them. It was something they had done all day. They cried more today than they ever had in their entire lives. Soon they were able to console them into calming down. Lincoln and Lynn wanted to give them time to grieve, but at that same time they knew that they needed to know their stories. They had to have managed to survive, and most importantly, where were Lori and Lenny? Luna wiped her eye, smearing purple eyeshadow in her head and hand, but she didn't care. She wasn't sure if she ever cared about her appearance again. The only thing that mattered now was her family. She knew that they were going to ask what happened, which meant she'd have to break the news to them. She knew it wouldn't be easy, just like it couldn't have been easy for Lynn to tell them about their mom. Eventually she calmed down enough, and the words that she dreaded more than anything were said. "So what happened? Did you see Lori or Lenny?" Lynn asked. Her siblings all had the same looks of anticipation on their faces. Luna looked down at Luann, whose eyes began to glisten with tears again. She looked back at her siblings, swallowing the lump in her throat, and spoke. "Sit down," she told them. Her voice was soft and tired. "What? Why?" Lynn asked. The shaking in her voice was obvious enough, even though she had said only 2 words. "Please." They all did as they were asked and huddled up to their older sisters. It took Luna a while to speak. She searched tremendously for words to form when she was about to tell them. She tried to imagine that she was writing a song and she just needed the right words to form the correct lyrics. She then tossed that thought out of her head. This wasn't a song. This was real life. "Well?" Lynn said impatiently, her voice still shaky. Luna looked at her siblings into their eyes one last time. taking in the desolate stares that they all possessed. It broke her heart knowing that these looks of bleakness were about to become looks of pure anguish. She decided that there was no more time to waste, and she would have to tell them what happened eventually. "I'm sorry, but," she began, "but Lori and Lenny, did they get separated?" Lynn interrupted. Now it sounded like she was trying to delay the inevitable. "No, are they still at the school?" Lincoln then said. The look of grave anticipation was evident in his face. They didn't make it home, we know," Lynn said. The volume of her voice began to rise. "No," Luna continued. Tears began to descend in her cheeks. "They're dead." "Don't say it," Lynn shouted, quickly standing up. Everyone looked up at her. "Don't you fucking say what I think you're about to say. Instead, tell me that they all got separated and they're still at the high school so I can go and rescue them." "Lynn," Lincoln said. His eyes began to water up again. "No!" Lynn turned to him. "Our older sisters are in trouble and we need to save them." "We can't save them," Luna told Lynn. "Why? Is it because the school is chock full of those fucking crazy adults? I don't give a fuck how many of them there are. I'm going to save them. Those fucking adults will be batshit insane to try and get in my way. You can't save them because they're dead!" Luna yelled. It felt as if a bomb had gone off inside everyone's chest as soon as Luna said that. The deafening silence that followed hung in the air like nuclear radiation. They all turned and looked at Luna, who sat with her neck still strained out from yelling at Lynn. Luann, who sat with her arms wrapped around her legs that were pressed against her body, buried her face behind them. "What?" said Lynn, even though she heard them clearly. "They're dead," Luna repeated, which hurt just as much as she first said it. "Or they're not alive anymore." "What do you mean, not alive?" Lincoln asked, his eyes looking extremely lost. "When we found them, they were... one of them..." Lynn began to wobble before planting her butt right back down the carpet again. Her face held a look of the infamous 1,000-yard stare. Lincoln also sat in silence as his younger siblings began to cry around him. Even Clyde was crying. Lincoln's mind raced a million miles an hour as he remembered his two oldest siblings. Lori, the eldest of the Loud siblings, and probably the siblings he was closest with. Just like Lincoln, she was a person of action, always trying to control the situation. She was an authority figure, practically their third parent. She brought order to the Lincoln house when Lincoln couldn't. Lincoln loved her, but sometimes she would get on his nerves. She could be quite pushy, condescending, irritable, and somewhat obnoxious. She overused the words literally and was always talking on her cell phone, mostly to her boyfriend Bobby. There was also the fact that she wouldn't let anyone go in her room without permission, which Lincoln could understand. However, she would get really angry if she caught one of her siblings in there, which only added to the stigma of her bad temper. Lincoln thought about earlier that morning when she blasted him for leaving the cap off the toothpaste bottle. He couldn't believe that would be the last thing they would ever argue about. The damn toothpaste cap. How cliché could you get? But as difficult as Lori could be, she also had very nice qualities about her. She cared deeply about her siblings. She always looked after them, helped out when their parents weren't around. Lori was also kind of insecure. She thrived off the attention and respect that her siblings had given her, but be it because she was left in charge while their parents were away or needed to drive them places since she was the only sibling with a driver's license, which is why when her siblings all tried to teach Lenny to drive, she became so worried that they stopped going to her for favors, that she tried to sabotage Lenny's chances of getting her driver's license by putting headphones on her that fed her incorrect information while she slept. There was also the time she tried to move in the garage, but she couldn't stay there because she got scared and didn't want to be alone, which Lincoln guessed was one reason why she was always texting Bobby. She needed validation and reassurance, be it from her siblings, her boyfriend, or her friends. Even so, Lincoln loved his eldest sister and would do anything for her, just like she would do anything for him. And Lenny, oh God, Lenny, bless her kind soul. She was always thinking of others, always doing her best even though she wasn't very bright, but that didn't mean she couldn't brighten up a room. She was super sweet and got along with everyone. Her artistic abilities more than made up for her lack of intelligence. She was a skilled artist, fashion designer, and she could tell Lincoln was pretty much everything about clothes design, a great deal at the mall. She also knew how to plan out events, like the time they tried to plan to throw a slumber party for their mom's birthday. They told Lenny to go all the way to Huzzletucky to get something from their mom as a distraction because she was always spoiling everyone's surprises. Not on purpose, of course. She just didn't know any better. But when they all failed to throw a good party, Lenny came up with a clutch. She'd thrown her mom the best surprise party ever, and then she accidentally told her dad that the surprise party was next. Lincoln couldn't believe that he was able to go back, that he was never going to be able to see them again, never going to talk to them nor hear their voices, never going to be able to hug them again. He had known that Lori dropping him off at school this morning would be the last time he'd see him. He would have looked at them while they hopped out of Anzilla and said a lot more than see ya. He would have looked at them in the eyes and told them that he loved them. The tears began to flow down Lincoln's face, as he now had another reason to cry. He cried for his sisters, for his parents, and for all the other members of his family that he was never going to see again. Eventually, his and his sister's crying subsided. Lincoln hoped that he had never had another reason to cry ever again. He turned to the two older siblings and asked them how they managed to survive there. The high school wasn't exactly a stone's throw away from their house. Luna and Luann looked to each other again, wondering if they could relive what had just happened before deciding that their siblings had to know what happened. They turned back to their siblings and Luna began to recount the horror they had faced. Luna strummed away at her electric guitar as she sat in the room at her favorite subject at school, the music room. She was immersed in the familiarity of the magnificent symphony of all the instruments in the room produced. What a perfect end to the school day, she thought. She was happy to be in a room that she loved, doing what she loved with people who shared the same interest. She looked up from her instrument and snuck a peek at the cute blonde girl with a blue streak in her hair. Her name was Sam, and Luna wanted nothing more to jam with her someday. A few weeks ago, Luna had anonymously put a note in her locker saying that she had a crush on her. Luna was nervous about how she would react to this confession, but judging by the smile that spread across her face as she read that note, she was sure that Sam was delighted that someone liked her enough to write her a love note. Luna then turned her attention towards the clock on the wall for only a few more minutes until the bell would ring, so that she could go home and hang out with her sisters and hopefully continue to spread her talent across the town of Royal Woods. Meanwhile, Luann, who wasn't as lucky as Luna, sat bored in her social studies classroom. She fidgeted with her pencil, glancing at the clock every 30 seconds. Those last 10 minutes couldn't go by fast enough. Like everyone else in the school, she looked forward to the weekend. She couldn't wait to perform at Kid's birthday party tomorrow. She loved making people laugh. It was what she was best at. Every laugh she brought onto the world only reassured her that she would go far in life. Someday she hoped to perform in front of an audience of thousands. But the day would probably never come, because a bright flash filled the sky, and then a loud bang filled the air, knocking everyone off their seats. The blast was loud enough that it reverberated throughout the entire school, resonating over the sounds of all the instruments. If it didn't cause the kids to stop playing, then the lights going out certainly did. The room was dark. Eventually, everyone began talking at once. The teacher tried his best to quiet everyone down when the sounds of screams drowned out the sounds of the kids' confusion. The teacher told everyone to stay put as he ran out in the halls. After a few minutes had passed, Luna's eyes began to adjust to the darkness. She looked at every other kid in the room. They all looked just as confused as she was. A lot of them were talking about a loud bang that came from beyond the walls. Some others were talking about the screams they heard coming from the hallway. A lot of them were talking about how their cell phones weren't turning on. Suddenly the door swung open. The sunlight from the windows in the hallway briefly poured into the room. They saw the silhouette of their music teacher standing in the doorway. The kid standing closest to him asked him what had happened. The teacher didn't say anything and instead snapped his head towards the kid and lunged at him. The door closed, sending the room back into darkness. Then the sound of the kid screaming permeated the air. Luna stood up, and she could sense everyone else standing up as well. A kid that sat next to the source of the scream took out a lighter and flicked it. The small flame filled the space around him, and everyone saw the teacher holding the screaming kid down to the ground and biting into him. "What the fuck?" the kid with the lighter shouted. He kicked the teacher in the ribs, only for him to ignore his blows and continue to dig into the kid. Several kids began to scream. While some of them charged towards the teacher, others made their way to the door. Luna was torn on what to do. She could help this kid or make a run for the door. But before she could decide, a big kid went behind the teacher and slammed a tuba on the teacher's back repeatedly. It wasn't affecting him at all. "Try the head," a kid yelled. The kid did as he was told, and it worked. Blood began to ooze from a wound in the teacher's head. The big kid, realizing what he had done, dropped the tuba and stood shocked. As the kid pulled the teacher off the kid, it was too late for him. There was enough incentive for Luna to run for the door. She shot one last look at the room as she opened the door. Sam and her friends were gone, and some other students, mostly juniors and seniors, began to cough hysterically. Luna wondered what was wrong with them before deciding that it was probably just nerves as she ran out the door. Luna didn't know what to do. Everywhere she looked, adults and other students were attacking younger teens, mostly consisting of freshmen and sophomores. "I've got to find my sisters," Luna told herself as she continued down the hall. She then noticed a group of kids wielding random weapons such as baseball bats, pencils, and other sharp tools making their way towards the freshman part of the school. Luna decided to stay close to them since she was also heading in the same direction. Tears filled Luann's eyes as she ran as fast as she could down the halls. The surge of crazy adults chased her and her classmates. She could feel them getting closer. Their outstretched hands were grazing her ponytail. She didn't want to suffer the same fate as her other poor classmate who had just happened to be the closest next to the teacher when he got back up and went bonkers on the poor boy. Luann could only scream and cry as the kids in front of her all outran her, and the hands of the adults continued to brush up against her. She imagined them digging into her with those same hands. That thought terrified her. She couldn't believe she was about to die a horrible death when only 10 minutes ago she was looking forward to going to a 6-year-old birthday party. Suddenly, a group of kids came around the corner. A lot of them were carrying random weapons. They all stopped in their tracks when they noticed a group of adults barreling towards them. Luann screamed and waved her arms frantically until she noticed that one of the kids was Luna. She screamed her name, and Luna's face filled with terror as she saw that her younger sister was only moments away from being torn to pieces. Luna threw the caution in the wind and ran towards her sister. This prompted the other kids to do the same. Luna ran past Luann and slammed into the nearest adult. They both fell to the ground, and Luna struggled to hold the grown-up down. A lot of adults halted and reached for Luna. Luann turned back and screamed her sister's name again. Luna looked around and noticed the heads all reaching for her now. She screamed. But then the other kids reached the group of adults and began to deliver devastating blows to their heads. The blood that boomed from their heads sprayed Luna, who continued to pin the adult to the ground with all her might. Then a kid stepped up to her and slammed a baseball bat down the adult's head, ending its blind rage in one furious blow. He let out a hand towards Luna, offering to help her up. Luann accepted. "That was sure brave of you, charging those things without a weapon," the boy said. He had a buzz cut and wore a shirt the words Army printed on it. Luna recognized the kid as Brock Harward, a strong, brawny kid who grew in a military family. "Thanks," she said, blushing. "Luna?" a voice cried out. Luna snapped out of her infatuation and looked to see Luann running towards her. They wrapped their arms around each other as soon as they converged. "Are you okay?" Luna asked. "What happened?" Luann told her as fast as she could about the teacher going nuts and attacking a student. Luna embraced Luann again and looked back at Bronk and thanked him again. "No problem," he said. "Do you girls want to follow us?" "No thanks, I gotta go find my other sisters. Hopefully they're okay." A look of pessimism spread across Brock's face. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I kinda noticed a pattern with all these deranged people." Luna quickly shut him down before he could finish. "I have to find them. I couldn't forgive myself if I didn't at least try." Brock nodded. "Okay, take one of these." He handed Luna a spare baseball bat. She thanked him. Then Brock and his friends continued down the hall. Luna turned back to Luann and told her that they had to find Lori and Lenny. Fear spread over Luann's face. As much as she wanted to leave the place as soon as possible, she knew that they'd have to go and find their older sisters after all. Lori had the keys to Vanzilla. They made their way over towards the junior section of the school. Luna gripped the bat tight as she ran past several screaming teens, the sound of death growing louder as they neared the halls where the older sister Lenny would likely be. Luna kept shooting quick glances to make sure Luann stayed close to her. Every time she looked, Luann wore the same dismal expression. Hopefully finding their two older sisters would change that. They finally reached a pair of double doors that signified they were around the 11th grade rooms. Luna and Lenny had algebra for her last period, so she ran straight for the certain room. The room soon came into view. Luna slowed down and took a look at Luann, who returned the glance. They walked slowly towards the room. The door was open, and there was a strange spongy sound emerging from it. They poked their heads through the doorway and saw Lenny and a few other kids kneeling around something. They looked to be eating. The two sisters stood in the doorway, waiting for something to happen. They studied their sister. Her hair was a mess, her sunglasses were no longer resting on her head, her dress had red stains all over, and she was no longer wearing her sandals. They both wanted to scream their sister's name and for her to turn around and look at them with her beautiful face and kind eyes, but all they could do was watch as she continued to stuff her face with an unknown substance. Once Luna couldn't take it anymore, she said Lenny's name, and their sister and all the other teens turned to face them. Luna and Luann's hearts both seemed to stop as they stared at their sister's blood-soaked face. It felt as though time stood still. Luna felt her grip loosening on the bat. Luann stood completely still. The only thing moving were the tears dropping down her face. Lenny and the other teens stood up and shrieked at the two newcomers. Luann covered her ears, closed their eyes, and began to cry. Luna screamed as the teens charged her and Luann. She shoved Luann away and slammed the door shut and pressed her body against it. Lenny and the other teens slammed against the door and tried their damnedest to break through it. Luna struggled to keep the door shut. Luann ran up to the door and pressed her body against it. "Get ready to run," Luna told Luann. Luann nodded her head, and suddenly an arm burst through the little window in the door and grabbed Luann's ponytail. Luann screamed louder than Luna had ever heard her scream before. Luna took the baseball bat and slammed the tip of it through the little window. She felt the impact of it hitting the teen in the face, but he wouldn't let go. Luna dropped the bat and began to pull on Luann's hair as hard as she could, tears streaming down Luann's face as she began to wail in pain. Luna hated that she had to do this, but it was the only way to free her sister from the monster's grasp. Finally, she managed to tug Luann away, and the crazy teen tore a lock of her hair away. Luann crouched to the ground and continued to cry in pain as she reached around and caressed her hair. Now, Luna was as mad as she picked up the bat and let the door swing open. The first teen emerged. Luna swung as hard as she could, and the sound of the bat connecting to the skull sent shivers up her spine. Another teen soon took his place and was met with the same fate. Next came Lenny. Luna felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to take a swing at Lenny. She instead shoved her to the ground, and the last teen appeared, still holding a lock of Luann's hair. Luann swung extra hard at this one. The force of the hit caused one of the eyeballs to pop out of its socket. As soon as the body hit the ground, Luna turned and looked at Lenny, who was now back on her feet and rushing Luna. Luna dropped the bat again and grabbed Lenny as she reached for her. She shoved her back into the classroom and shut the door. It wasn't as hard to keep the door closed as it was before, since Lenny wasn't that strong. However, her desire to consume human flesh seemed to increase her strength. Luna continued to lean her body against the door as she turned to Luann and asked her if she was okay. "No, I'm not okay," she cried. A chunk of her hair was noticeably missing. Luann then removed the bun from her hair and let it hang down. "We need to find Lori," Luna urged. Luann continued to crouch on the ground and began to shake her head. "How do we know if she isn't already dead?" "We have to try," Luna barked. "First, we must take care of Lenny," she thought. And with that, she picked up the bat and let the door open again. Lenny quickly emerged and lunged towards Luna. She couldn't bring herself to kill her sister and instead swung the bat at Lenny's leg. The snapping sound that followed broke Luann's heart as the older sister came crashing to the ground. Luna then brought Luann to her feet as they ran, as Lenny fruitlessly crawled after them. Her raspy wails of hunger devastated the two sisters. They soon reached the senior part of the school. They were both ready for an impending heartbreak should they discover that Lori suffered the same fate as Lenny. They listened closely at the sound of rage-filled creatures echoing throughout the halls. All around them, the floors were stained with blood, and the smell that filled the air was horrible. Suddenly, the sound of someone screaming caused them to stop dead in their tracks. A kid came limping around the corner as fast as he could. Suddenly, a pack of teens emerged as well and swamped him. Tears came back in his sister's eyes as they noticed that one of the teens had thick blonde hair and wore a blue tank top and brown cargo shorts. Luna and Luann were powerless to help the poor teen. Instead, they both turned and ran into an empty room. They jammed some desks against the door to barricade it. Now they really let the tears flow. "Did you see her?" Luna asked through her sobs, and Luann confirmed it with a nod of her head. They both backed away from the door, plopped down, and held each other as they cried. They cried because one of the teens that beset the kid was none other than their eldest sister, Lori Loud. Luna and Luann looked out the window to the room they hid in. The glass on it was shattered as well. "Let's get the hell out of here," Luna said. Luann didn't need to be told twice. They hopped out the window and ran into the chaos of the new world. They had decided that they would have to run to their younger siblings' school to see if they were still there. As they ran, they took one last look at their school. The thoughts of the sisters devouring the other kids still haunt them till the day that they died. Hopefully today wouldn't be that day. They quickly found and ran with a large group of kids who were fleeing in the same direction they were. Eventually, they spotted the middle school before they ran into a tough-looking girl wearing a helmet ran out. Luna and Luann recognized the girl as Lynn's friend, Polly Payne. They asked her if they had seen Lynn, and she told them that she ran that way. She pointed in the direction that made it obvious that their sisters were the sisters that Lynn was running towards a younger sibling's school. They thanked her and went on their way. Relieved that they wouldn't have to enter the nightmare that was the middle school, they stuck with the group of kids who all worked together to fiend off attacking adults. Soon they reached the elementary school. Luna and Luann braced themselves as they ran into the school. They searched every one of their sisters' classrooms, but they were nowhere to be found. Every puddle of blood made them fret. They imagined fully grown adults chomping down on them and ripping their guts out. Soon they ran into a small group of tough-looking teens. Luna and Luann recognized them. They all greeted each other. "Have you seen any of our siblings?" Luna asked them. She didn't need to name them since everyone in Royal Woods knew who the Loud family was. "No, we haven't, sorry," said a dark-haired boy who Luna and Luann knew as Stan Parker. "Have you seen my sister?" Luna and Luann shook their heads and apologized as well. Before Stan could say anything, some of his friends told him to hurry up. They all looked at the kids that stood beside them. One of them was Duke Melville. He was kind of a jerk sometimes, and the kid that stood next to him was Joey Moore. Everyone thought of him as Duke's sidekick. "Okay," Stan said. He took one last look at the sisters that all wished each other luck as Stan continued down the halls. Luann turned to Luna. "Now what?" she said. "We just have to go home and hope that they're there." Luann smiled and nodded, and the sisters ran out of the school and continued home. Their sounds of their heavy breathing and quick footsteps were the only sounds that accompanied them as they passed many scenes of chaos. Dead kids and adults polluted the streets. Luckily, they didn't come across any crazy teenagers or adults. They didn't notice black smoke floating towards the sky. They passed a crashed, burning airplane. The sisters couldn't imagine how terrible it must have been to witness such a scene. Soon they reached the house and noticed that their neighbor, Mr. Grouse, sprawled dead on the ground. They also noticed the screwdriver that was driven to the back of his head. That screwdriver either belonged to Lucy or Lana, they thought. They reached for the door and it was locked. They began to pound on it and scream, hoping that their mom and siblings would be waiting in the house to open the door and greet them. They were half right. The Loud House remained silent for a few minutes after the story had finished. Thoughts of their sisters committing cannibalism was too much to bear. Lincoln couldn't even imagine how hard it must have been for his sisters to witness Lenny's terror trickle of blood and Lori chomp down on that poor kid. "Why didn't you put them down?" Len finally asked. Luna and Luann looked at her. "What?" Luna asked with a hint of vexation in her voice. "You heard me," Len said as she stood up. "Why didn't you end their suffering?" Luna stood up as well. "You expect me to kill my own sisters? Maybe you would have been doing them a favor. Every second of their existence could be pure agony. They could be trapped inside their minds, screaming for mercy, begging for someone to put them out of their misery. We don't know that," Luann interceded. "Yeah," Luna agreed. "For all we know, they could have been content in their bodies. Each and every one of them could be living their own happy place, enjoying their life." Lynn stepped up to Luna and stared in their eyes. "Do those things out there look content to you?" She growled in a cold, desolate voice. Tears began to well up in Luna's eyes, causing Lynn to back away. Luna wished more than anything that she could get the image of Lori and Lenny's dead, angry scowls out of their mind, but there was no forgetting the look of reckless abandon in their eyes as they devoured the prey without the slightest hint of remorse. "You're right," Luna said. "I thought I was doing the right thing by sparing Lenny. There might not have been any way for us to get to Lori, but I had my chance to put Lenny down and I blew it. Now she's probably going to be forced to crawl around until someone takes the incentive to put her down until the sun stops shining." The younger siblings began to silently weep at the thought of this. Luna hated the thought of that as well. She also hated the phrase put down. It felt like she was calling her sister a wild animal. And she wasn't, at least not the Lenny she knew. Lynn looked down at Luann, who was back to hiding her face. It must have really hurt when that dude ripped a chunk from her hair. She then thought about her own ponytail. She figured there was only one thing they do. She walked upstairs and into the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror in the bathroom wall. As much as she loved sporting her ponytail, she knew she couldn't risk an adult grabbing it. She'd hate for it to be her downfall. She opened the mirror cabinet and took out a pair of scissors. She opened the mirror, took one last look at her hair, brown hair, and watched as she held up her ponytail and pressed the scissors together. Snip. She held a lock of hair up into the sunlight and studied it. It reminded her of all the sports she had ever played. She thought back on all the good memories, all the competitions, all the goals she had set for herself, and all the records she had broken, and how her parents and siblings were always there to cheer her on every step of the way, and now her parents would never be able to cheer for her again. She threw the lock of hair into the wastebasket and then turned to look at herself in the mirror. The back of her hair was less than shoulder length. She then envied out of her hair with a few more trims, and now her hair was just as short as Lisa's. She looked at the scissors again and slammed them as hard as she could against the mirror and yelled, "Fuck!" The sound of the footsteps running up the stairs filled the house. "Lynn!" Luna yelled. "What happened?" All of her siblings stood in front of the bathroom, gawking at her short hair. "I decided to give myself a haircut," Lynn answered, pointing to her head. "Why did you?" "So we don't end up like her." She pointed to Luann, who winced as Lynn stuck a finger towards her. "Okay," said Luna, as she held out her hand in front of her, taking a few steps towards her. "What?" Lynn demanded. She looked at her hand that was still clenching the scissors. It was bleeding. "Ah." She laughed suddenly, remembering the shattered mirror. "Yeah, I only did that because I was pissed." "It's okay," Luna told her. "I'm scared too." Lynn's face contorted into a look of rage. "Who the fuck said I was scared?" Sweat began to dribble down Lynn's face again. "I'm the bravest fucking person in this fucking house." Lynn looked at all the younger siblings and noticed a look of fear on their faces. She looked down and noticed the blood pouring from her hand at an alarming rate. She dropped the scissors and swore. Luna reached her sisters and held up her arm to get a better look at her hand. "Lincoln, go get the first aid kit," she demanded. He ran downstairs. "I'm not scared," Lynn repeated as her mind began to wander. She saw herself standing in front of the elementary school. "I'm not scared," she told herself as she imagined herself running into the building and taking out as many adults as she could, while all the kids cheered on her and chanted her name. "Lynn! Lynn! Lynn! Lynn!" Luna's voice woke her up from her daydream. She looked and saw Lincoln arrive with the first aid kit. "Lisa, can you give me a hand?" Luna asked. The younger sister walked up and studied the injury. "That's gonna need some stitches," she remarked. 1 week later. The kids all sat in the attic, all of them bored out of their minds. They had played every board game, let Lucy give an eulogy to their mom, and explored every inch of the attic. They were running out of food, diapers for Lily's, and patience. After things calmed down with Lynn, Luna decided it was best if their other siblings shortened their hair as well. Everyone but Lola agreed. It took some convincing to get her to allow them to cut her luxurious hair, as she called it. Some had also changed into more appropriate attire. Luna and Luann no longer wore their skirts under. Instead, they wore alongside their siblings pants that would be easier to run in. They also changed into shoes that would be more easier to run in as well. "I can't wait up here any longer," Lynn groaned. "Would you rather take your chances out there?" Luna asked. "Yes," Lynn answered. Luna sighed. "Where would we even go?" she asked. "Anywhere but here." Luna wondered if there was anyone else left alive in the town of Royal Woods. It had been a few days since they last saw a living person run by their house. Luna looked at Lisa and asked what she thought that they should do. She had told them that it was usually better to stay put in a regular situation, but this wasn't a regular situation. They all voted whether they should stay or go, and the majority ruled with the latter. "Alrighty then," Luna said. "Go pack some clothes and whatever you can't live without, and we'll leave in a few hours." The Loud family searched their rooms for their most treasured items. Lincoln knew exactly what he was taking with them. He grabbed his stuffed animal, Bun Bun. Once he was all packed, he headed downstairs and looked at the framed picture of his family portrait on the shelf in the fireplace, removed it, folded it up, and gingerly placed it into his pocket. It would be the only thing that would bring he and his siblings would remember Lori and Lenny by. Luna really wanted to take her favorite guitar with her, but she knew it would be too big to carry around. She hated that she had to leave it behind. Hopefully, wherever they ended up had some musical instruments she could use to keep to herself and others entertained. Luann wondered on whether or not she should take her ventriloquist dummy Mr. Coconuts with her, but decided against it. What use could he have been? She closed his eyes and put him back in his case. Hopefully someday she could come back for him. But for now, the only thing she could bring was special with her was her own mind, where all her jokes she stored. She was about to pull Mr. Coconut's case under her bed when she thought of a better idea. Lynn grabbed her favorite baseball bat and her lucky jockstrap. She swung the bat slowly a few times, trying to imagine herself swinging at adults. Lucy chose to bring her poetry journal with her, a few screwdrivers. She waited for Lynn to leave the room, and she turned her bust to Edwin and kissed it goodbye. She hated having to depart without it, but she couldn't expect to carry it around with her. That's when she noticed Luann standing in the doorway. "You didn't see me kiss Edwin, did you?" she asked, embarrassed. "Unfortunately," Luann answered. Lucy sighed and felt herself blush. Luckily for her, it didn't show. Luann then held up her dummy. "Is it okay if I leave Mr. Coconuts with Edwin?" "Sure," Lucy answered. Luann smiled and rested the dummy on Lucy's bed. "Hey, handsome," she made the dummy say. Lucy exhaled out of her nose. "Thanks for leaving me with a vampire. If I was left in this case, I would have gotten so bored. Get it?" he asked. Lucy nodded. Luann made Mr. Coconut's face Edwin. "I'm sure hope my jokes aren't a bust." A bright smile formed on Lucy's face. "Goodbye, Mr. Coconuts," Luann said. "Take care of Edwin for me," Lucy told the dummy. "Don't worry, I'll make sure nothing sucky happens to him." And with that, Luann and Lucy left the room and closed the door behind them. Lana decided to bring a wrench and tool belt with her, along with her pet frog Hops and lizard Izzy. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be able to bring all of her pets with her, so she had to let them go. Lola decided to bring her favorite tiara and some of her makeup and other beauty supplies. Despite the apocalyptic world outside, she still wanted to look beautiful. Lisa gathered up as much of her science equipment as she could and some notebooks. She hoped that wherever they ended up, she'd be able to study one of the adults and come up with a cure. Lily was waiting in her crib. It was decided that they would bring her purple blanket and her stuffed giraffe. Clyde shuffled around Lori and Lenny's room. He rummaged around Lori's things. He felt kind of bad, like he was invading her privacy, but at the same time, she was one of those things. She wouldn't care what Clyde did at this point. He looked inside the closet and her heart sank when he saw the gifts he had given to Lori. She kept all of them. He thought to himself as tears began to fill his eyes. He removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. He knew Lori cared about him. He just didn't know how she cared this much. As much as he wanted to take all her clothes and makeup, she decided just to take a small framed picture of her. He had many pictures of her, but they were all at his house, so this one would have to do. He removed it from the frame, folded it up, and placed it into his pocket. Clyde took one last look at it as he left the room. "I love you, Lori Loud." He wiped another tear away, realizing that he'd never hear it said back. Once they were all packed, they gathered in the living room. Lynn distributed his spare baseball bats to Luna, Luann, Lincoln, and Clyde. Luna looked outside. There wasn't a single person in sight. She turned to Lisa, her smartest sister. The one who told them all the meteor would look likely have caused all this also seemed to act as an electromagnetic pulse, thus rendering all electronics inoperable. "Do you think any cars might still be able to work?" "Only ones made during or before the early 1980s, Lisa answered. Luna nodded. "Mr. Grouse's car is pretty old. Do you think it'll work?" "Hopefully." "Alright, everyone ready?" They all looked at each other and then back at Luna and nodded. "Okay, let's go." Luna reached for the doorknob, not before taking one last look in the living room and the door to their parents' room. "Goodbye, Mom." The only adult in sight was Mr. Grouse's dead body. They all ran quietly over to his house. Luckily, the front door was unlocked, so they didn't have to risk cutting themselves on the glass trying to squeeze through his window. They found his keys hanging on a rack besides the door to the garage. They opened the door to his garage and can faintly see his car parked in the darkness. "Yep, that's definitely pre-1980s, Lynn remarked. They all had to lift the garage door open manually. Soon, once the afternoon sunlight filled the garage, they all packed into the car. It was nowhere near as big as Vanzilla, so the younger siblings had to sit in the older siblings' laps while Luann sat in the passenger seat and Luna sat in the driver's seat. Seeing as she was the oldest, she would have to drive it. She placed the key into the ignition. The car rumbled loudly every time she turned the key. She was worried about the sound would attract adults. Luckily, by the fifth try, the car boomed to life. Luna smiled as the sound reverberated through the garage. She shifted the car into reverse and began to back out. The car was loud, and she prayed that it wasn't announcing the presence to every adult within a 5-mile radius. "This sound always drives me crazy," Luann giggled. All of her other siblings laughed as well. Her jokes were a welcome addition to the new world. They needed whatever distractions they could to use to keep them from thinking about all the pain and misery they had witnessed. As they drove away, Luna looked at the rearview mirror and watched the house shrink away. All her siblings looked back to see the house shrink away as well. The loud house. The place where they spent their entire lives. The place that held so many memories. The good, the bad, the funny, the sad. They thought their mom lying dead on the bathroom floor, and all things that left behind. Hopefully someday they'd be able to return to their home, their place of happiness someday. Goodbye, house. Chris sat alone, staring at his blank television screen. He was running low on meat. He was pissed that this had to happen when he planned to prey on more kids later that night. He then heard footsteps walking right by his house, accompanied by the sounds of something dragging. He went over and looked out of his window, and on the sidewalk he saw an adult dragging the body of a dead fat kid. So juicy, Chris thought. Wish I could feast on him. The adult suddenly stopped and turned towards his house. Huh? Chris wondered why the adult stopped walking and stared right at him. The adult began walking towards him. Oh no. Chris slowly started to back away from his window as the adult came closer. Then the adult began to knock on the front door. Chris stood still and the adult simply stood on the opposite side of the door. I know you're in there, Chris heard the voice in his mind. What the fuck? Chris screamed in his mind. Am I going crazy? He wondered. No, you're not, the voice in his head answered. What do you want? Chris thought. I just want to share this big juicy kid with you. Chris thought back on to when he was at his job and all the adults were fighting over the kids, sharing what was the last thing they wanted to do. Why me? I can sense your vibes, the adult answered. You're giving off more energy than any adult I've encountered. You're a natural-born leader, and I'd be honored to give you this kid as an offering. Chris wondered if this adult was pulling his leg. How do I know you won't attack me as soon as I open the door? The adult pondered on how he would be able to get to Chris to trust him. As a show of good faith, I'll leave this kid's body here and walk away from the door. Chris heard the adult set the kid down and set several steps back. He then looked out of his window and saw the adult standing all the way to the sidewalk. When the adult noticed him, he looked at him smiling and waved. His face looked sick and pale, and the smile only added to the creepiness factor. Chris slowly walked over to the door, opened it, dragged the body in, and slammed and locked the door, all in less than 5 seconds. I'll be out here when you're done feasting on him, the adult voice continued on his mind. We have much to discuss. Chris wondered what there could be to talk about, and he looked down at the fresh meat. This should be interesting.
In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horde-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.